Well, hello, Dr. Gordon. Thank you for joining us once again. It's an honor and a privilege, and from what I understand, this will be the last of our sort of Zoom version presentations because you're coming back in March. Not to let the cat out of the bag, but I was just so excited. I wanted to share that right off the bat.
Well, we're happy to escape from the freezer here in Chicago, believe me.
Well, it's pretty rough here too. I'm looking outside, and the palm fronds are moving slightly, and it's probably about 60, maybe 70. So, like,
Well,
comfortable.
we have penguins on our street, so forget it.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. And for those of you that for some reason are unaware of Dr. Edward Gordon, let me just give you a little introduction here. This gentleman is someone that has been a friend and a supporter of the museum for we're getting close to 20 years now, and I personally consider it a great honor to call him my friend. Dr. Edward Gordon, he's an internationally known historian, speaker, researcher, and author. He's taught history at DePaul University in Chicago. He's presented hundreds of historical programs across America to professional groups, universities, community groups, trade associations, and museums such as ours. So we've had that great luck to have this relationship all these years. Dr. Gordon is also the president and founder of Imperial Consulting Corporation, author of more than 20 books and 300 articles in history, business, and education. So if you get a chance to pick his brain, I tell you, he can talk to you on a number of topics and enlighten you quite a bit. I've always appreciated those discussions as well. His most recent book, Divided on D-Day, How the Conflicts and Rivalries Jeopardized the Allied Victory in Normandy, co-authored with David Ramsey, was published recently. And in March, we're going to have a chance to get an opportunity to get a signed copy. I'm very excited about that. He's appeared on CBS's network, The Early Show, PBS NewsHour, National Public Radio, and many, many other media venues. Dr. Gordon earned his BA and MA degrees from DePaul and his PhD from Loyola University in Chicago. And we're here today to talk about the fighting in Okinawa in World War II, the Crucible of the Pacific. A topic that, although weighty, is something that should definitely be considered as we look at the events of World War II. So, Dr. Gordon, thank you for joining us. A pleasure to have you here, and but please take it away.
All right. Well, let's get started. So today we will talk about a major engagement and battle. In every war, there are outstanding battles in the annals of the Second World War and operations. And one that stands out above all the others in the Pacific War is Okinawa, which became the Crucible of the Pacific. So this is the story of the invasion of that island in 1945. First, let's take a look at our agenda. Well, we're going to outline for you briefly the Operation Iceberg, which was the American invasion or the Allied invasion of Okinawa, the strategies, preparations, D-Day itself, the naval operation that the Japanese launched with the remainder of their fleet, including the world's largest battleship, Yamato, and then the different phases of the mainland battle, which dragged on, as you see, from April all the way to the end of June. The kamikaze attacks, which were repeated, the typhoons, and then we'll take a look at the aftermath and casualties. As you can see, this is a very long and complex battle, and I'll try to go through it as simply as I can, but really connect all the pieces. There are many other parts to it. There are books, certainly, on the Battle of Okinawa that you might enjoy reading. Well, at the start of 1945, you can see how the Japanese Empire in the Pacific had constricted. By then, most of the Japanese Navy had been sunk. Most and their best pilots, carrier pilots, were dead. Their merchant marine was largely destroyed. Japan now was suffering from a lack of raw materials because they couldn't import them now from the parts of their empire. And the people were beginning to starve because they couldn't import food either. On the other end, the Japanese still had considerable military forces at their disposal. In China, there were millions of Japanese army forces. There were still thousands, tens of thousands of airplanes, and the Japanese, of course, had started to perfect their kamikaze attacks, first in the Philippine Sea with the invasion of the Philippines. And now they were getting prepared for the invasion of Japan, but also Okinawa, which was considered part of the mainland empire of Japan. You can see Okinawa here. I'll point it out to you if you don't see it. Now, the island of Okinawa itself was not a very beautiful land, but strategically, this rocky outcrop was 60 miles long and 18 miles wide. It was only 350 miles south of mainland Japan. And for that reason, for the Allies, it offered harbors, air bases, and it was a perfect base from which the Allies could launch their invasion of Japan. Now, for the Japanese, however, it was a great strategic defense site because it was large enough so that the Americans would deploy a sizable force. It was also smaller than the Philippines, where the Americans would launch these huge rapid operational maneuvers to crush their troops. They couldn't do that in Okinawa. And at the same time, it was near the island of Crucible and also Formosa, so the Japanese could launch their thousands of aircraft, whereas the Americans, it was too far from other land bases, and they would have to rely completely upon carrier-based planes to defend their fleet and also to launch attacks. The island itself had a small rural economy, but it was overpopulated with over 500,000 people. Let's now take a look at Operation Iceberg, the Allied plan to invade the island. So in the spring of 45, after the successful island hopping campaign that started way down in Guadalcanal in 1942, this was now the last phase of that campaign before the invasion of mainland Japan. Iceberg was going to show a formidable array of combat-hardened Marine and Army units who would now take Okinawa. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Bruckner and his 10th Army. And in there was General Hodge and his 24th Corps. And then for the Marines was Major General Geiger and his 3rd Marine Amphibious Corps. You ended up with 3 Marine divisions and 4 Army divisions, which was over 155,000 men in the initial invasion. By the time the invasion would end, there would be 300,000 U.S. troops on the island. For naval operations, we had Admiral Spruance and his 5th Fleet. This was composed of Admiral Turner and his Task Force 51, which was composed of 300 warships and more than 1,000 transport and landing craft. Also attached to it was the 8th Carrier Fleet Force, Task Force 58, which had 4 powerful carrier groups commanded by Admiral Mitchener. With it was now a contingent of the British Navy. By this time, the war in Europe was over and the British could redeploy, and they sent Vice Admiral Rawlings and his Task Force 57. The Pacific Fleet had 2 battleships, 4 carriers, 6 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, and 23 other warships. It included the HMS carrier Implacable, which had 450 planes. It had an armored flight deck, which became very important, as you will hear during this battle, and the combined Empire fleet had units from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Now, this Allied aircraft carriers, again, were very important because I wish to emphasize that they had no other air cover for the invasion or the defense of the invasion fleet except carrier planes, whereas the Japanese could throw literally thousands of aircraft at this invasion. Now, let's take a look at the Japanese forces available. The American reconnaissance thought there were only 65,000 enemy troops. However, I must tell you, the long-range reconnaissance that we conducted was faulty. There were far more troops on the island. Okinawa, of course, is very rugged and forested with many limestone ridges and natural defense caves, which the Japanese increased. This is Admiral Yoshijima, who commanded a force of 77,000 Japanese combat forces, another 20,000 reserve troops, about 100,000, plus he supplemented it by forcing native Okinawans into support roles for the Japanese military forces. Let's now look at the strategies. First, the Allied. Well, let's look at the map. What the Allies were intended to do, as you can see here, they intended to invade here on the south part of the island. The Marines would advance to the north, whereas the Army would cut off the southern part and take the southern island itself. There were several airfields on the island, which they, of course, wanted to seize very quickly because the Japanese had 65 airfields on Formosa and 55 on the southern island of Crucible in mainland Japan. This is a total of up to 3,000 aircraft that could be thrown at the invasion. They also knew that the Japanese would use kamikaze tactics again, and they were, of course, very fearful of this. So they wanted to get these airfields in operation on the south and the northern part so that they would have better defenses. Now, for the Japanese, the high command knew that putting troops on the beaches was a death sentence because they would be pulverized by the Allied fleet of both battleships and from the air. Instead, they decided to construct defensive positions, particularly here in the south. They would build tremendous defensive lines and lure the Americans in and slaughter them. Their concept was very simple. Make this battle as costly as possible so that the Allies would get sick of fighting and come to the conference table, and they would get better terms before Japan would end the war. This is what we faced. This is a typical bunker that was used by the Japanese for the bitter defensive struggle that would occur on the southern part of the island. This was a last-ditch strategy. However, the kamikazes were going to be used at maximum strength. Here was the overall plan. The Japanese would send the remaining part of their navy to attack the U.S. fleet, and at the same time would send their kamikazes, thousands of them, to attack the fleet. The combination of those naval, air, and sea elements would so just hurt the American invasion fleet that the Americans on the island that had landed would be marooned, and the Japanese could then counterattack and destroy the American invasion force. That was the plan. Let's get right direction here, guys. Okay. So the Allies were very worried about the air attacks. So they deployed Michener's aircraft carrier group for a series of raids on Japan before the invasion. between the 18th and 21st. They shot down 160 aircraft and destroyed many on the ground in Japan. However, 3 carriers, Wasp, Yorktown, and Franklin, were badly damaged by kamikaze attacks. At the same time, they launched continuous air attacks across the Okinawa itself to weaken the defenses. And then on March the 23rd, the invasion fleet opened up with a heavy bombardment and shelling of the island of Okinawa. Much of this was ineffective because the Japanese had burrowed deep into the mountains of this island that were impervious to the shelling and air attack. Now, at the bottom of this screen, and I'll point it out to you, are the Kumamoto group of islands. Before the invasion began, let me get my pointer working better here. There we are. There we are. Before the invasion began, the Americans landed. This is 15 miles to the west of Okinawa. They landed and took these islands. They captured 350 small suicide boats that the Japanese had intended to use to destroy the surface fleet. Some had hand grenades and manned by 2 or 3 man crews. So they removed this potential hazard to the main, for the main invasion. So on April 1st, 1945, on Easter Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, after a 3-hour preparatory bombardment, the Marines and Army landed on the southern island. And they landed here with a diversionary attack here. And it was an 8-mile wide beachhead. By 9 o'clock, the beaches were swarming with Allied troops and tanks. And the troops moved rapidly inland into the interior of the island. By 11, the Marines had taken one of the airfields and kept moving northward. By 4 p.m. that day, 50,000 troops had landed. Now, after the other Iwo Jima and the other earlier island campaigns, they were stunned. There was no opposition. Where were the Japanese? They thought this is a walkover. They shook their heads. What is going on here? Over 48 hours, the American patrols fanned out inland across the island. By April 13th, they had cleared northern Okinawa. By April, the intelligence officers learned that the Ujima and the bulk of his troops now were waiting in the south of the island. And of course, the idea was to lure the Americans into that position where they could not be supported by naval gunfire and then wipe them out. And for several days, Hodges' 24th Corps felt its way south very slowly, and there was no real land battle. Then on April 5th, they ran into the bulk of the Japanese troops in concealed defenses, the Mashinato line. He unleashed his largest concentration of artillery assembled by the Japanese army during the entire war. He had 287 heavy field pieces, and the American soldiers started frantically digging into these volcanic soil, and of course the dying began. Now, at the same time as this started, the Japanese launched their Operation Tengo, and this was the suicidal naval air attack with the kamikazes first crippling the amphibious forces and ships, and then the monster battleship Yamato, a 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers, then sailing southward, and finishing off a large part of the American invasion fleet. Well, here it is. At 72,908 tons, the largest battleship ever built. Yamato had formidable armament. It had 146 machine guns for aerial defense. It was 863 feet in length. It had 9 18-inch guns, 12 6-inch guns, 12 5-inch guns, 4 13-millimeter guns, and finally, as I said, over 146 anti-aircraft guns, and had 6 of its own aircraft. So now here's a map of the proposed route from the island sea of Japan all the way down to Okinawa. The vessels had no air cover and only had enough fuel for a one-way trip. This was the last desperate throw of the Japanese. Now, U.S. submarines had been deployed, and they saw the deployment and the sortie and alerted Michener's carrier force, backed up by his battle fleet. Now, remember, the Yamato's guns were so big that they could shell our battleships from a greater distance than the U.S. battleships could reach the Yamato. So this was a major threat. So Yamato sailed south, and on April the 7th, at the same time, the first kamikaze assault occurred against the United States fleet. 355 kamikaze aircraft and an additional 340 additional orthodox aircraft attacked. Dive bombers, torpedo planes swept in. 383 Japanese planes were shot down. We lost 2 destroyers, 2 ammunition ships, a minesweeper, a landing ship, and 24 other ships were damaged in the U.S. fleet. However, the kamikazes did not break through to the carriers, and they were not damaged. And the majority of the fleet was untouched, which meant that Yamato was sailing right into its death trap. And already the Japanese battle plan for the defense of Okinawa was unraveling. April 7th, there you see the Yamato and its cruiser support being attacked by Michener's carrier planes shortly after noon. Wave after wave of 280 American planes struck the ship. It sustained 7 bomb and 12 torpedo hits. After nearly 4 hours of constant plummeting, the Yamato lay helpless on her beam, and at 4:23, she slid under the Pacific. Almost 2,500 officers and men of the Japanese Navy went down with her. In all, 3,600 Japanese sailors met their deaths in this last fling of the Japanese Imperial Navy. U.S. losses, 15 planes, 84 seamen and pilots. However, it will be noted that if the Japanese had provided its remaining air power to cover this sortie, the Yamato might very well have made it to Okinawa and unleashed its huge 18-inch guns that had a range of 42,000 yards, far exceeding our battleships. However, the reason they didn't do that is simple. The Japanese simply did not have enough planes and pilots to both attack the American fleet and try to destroy it from the air and provide air cover for the Yamato at the same time. So now let's look at the land battle Phase 1, April 6th to the 30th. Well, here's the question. What was combat hell like on Okinawa? Well, here's a taste for an answer. So while the Marine 6th Division cleared northern Okinawa, the U.S. Army's 96th and 7th Infantry Divisions attacked across the narrow base of the South. The 96th Infantry Division encountered fierce resistance from the Japanese, holding these fortified positions along Highway 1, about 5 miles northwest of Shuri. And this position became known as Cactus Ridge. From here, the Japanese opposition from this rocky peak was 1,000 yards southwest of what they called the Pinnacle. On April the 8th, American troops cleared several of these fortified positions, but in doing so, they suffered 1,500 battle casualties. They killed or captured 4,500 Japanese. Now, then they realized this was only an outpost to the main battle line. This was not the main battle line. The next Japanese objective was Karasuku Ridge, 2 hills connected by the outer defenses of the Japanese. The Japanese hid in fortified caves. The Japanese then sent Okinawans at gunpoint out to obtain water and supplies, which led to heavy civilian casualties. The American advance was unstoppable, but still resulted in high casualties on both sides. This land campaign was very protracted because the Japanese in the south of the island would do small counteroffensives, but these were easily repulsed. In the meanwhile, the 6th Marine Division was pushing northward. But the Japanese had only scattered resistance, and by May 6th, the balance was heavily in the favor of the Americans. 2,500 Japanese were killed in the north. Marine detachment reached the northern tip of Okinawa on April the 13th without opposition. In the meanwhile, on April 19th, Hodge's 24th Corps launched a major attack with 3 Army divisions on Japanese positions in the south of Okinawa. There was intense preparatory naval bombardment, air, sea, land, etc. But it had very little effect on the Japanese. The gains were very slight, the casualties were gigantic. Even after the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions were redeployed from the north into the south, the advance was very slow. It would take 2.5 months for the Americans to dismantle, cave by cave, the Japanese defenses in Okinawa. This was arduous and deadly, and the source of the 8,000 or so Americans killed in the struggle. Well, let's take a look. Why was this defense so deadly? Here is a picture of a map, actually, of what these Japanese defenses looked like in Okinawa. You can see here, if I can get my pointer to work, you can see here the cave system that the Japanese had built between all of these defenses, many of them interconnected. They had blasted out of solid rock these positions yard by yard, and they did a absolutely magnificent job of withdrawing and fighting delaying actions. This is a picture of an interior of the Japanese tunnel. You can see how sophisticated this was. The Japanese soldiers would remain hidden in these deep tunnels during bombardment to basically then emerge afterwards and fight, sometimes in the rear of the American troops. Many of the systems were interconnected, so they could be shifted underground to threaten battle positions. A frustrated American officer wrote, We poured a tremendous amount of metal into those positions. It seemed nothing could possibly be living in that churning mass where the shells were falling and roaring. But when we advanced, the Japanese would still be there, even madder than they had been before. In the fighting, the Americans relied heavily on tank infantry teams to reduce this dug-in enemy. The tanks would provide accurate direct weapon power, and they would mount, many of them, flamethrowers, which were very effective because the Japanese were vulnerable to assault by flamethrower and also armed explosive charges. However, even the battleship fire failed to penetrate most of these Japanese caves. One of the innovations that the Americans finally developed was to get these tanks very close to the entrance of the caves, where they then would attach hoses so that troops, infantry, could then use the hose with high pressure containers and creep forward and kill the Japanese in their caves. Here you can see an example of this. They would spray jelly gasoline on suspected positions. They'd soak the target, ignite the fuel, and allow it to seep into the caves and foxholes and wipe out the Japanese. Manchester who would later achieve great distinction as a historian, William Manchester, he served as a sergeant in a Marine battalion. This is what he wrote. To be avoided and if necessary ignored were gung-ho platoon leaders who drew enemy fire by ordering spectacular charges against these positions. The ground gained wasn't much, and it had to be won in the end by small groups of Americans, 5 or 6 in a cluster, who would move very slowly forward on a sort of auto-hypnosis, he called it, advancing in mysterious concert with similar groups on their flanks. April 12th and 13th saw the renewal of kamikaze assaults against the American fleet. Between mid-April and to the end of June, there would be repeated assaults by the Japanese. Japanese aviators rescued from the sea at the beginning of this. He boasted to his captors on the carrier Hancock. They would all soon be killed by a massive kamikaze attack on April 11th. So Task Force 58 got ready for them. True enough, the Missouri would be crashed once, Enterprise twice, destroy a Kincaid once, but they suffered comparatively light damage. On April 11th, the kamikazes came in great strength from airfields scattered throughout the southern island of Japan of Crucible. Hundreds lifted their planes into the sky for a final sortie against the enemy. Their foreheads were girdled with a white bandana. Their farewell letters had been mailed to their families. The kamikazes were first employed at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 in an earlier program that we had presented at the museum. Maybe some of you attended that. The Japanese had a severe shortage of ships, aircraft, and pilots, so they decided to use this sort of a battle of suicide attrition. The pilots were fanatical young men, introduced into a chilling and dangerous twist to the war for themselves and the Americans. The tactical battle of the kamikaze, the divine wind, was referring to a typhoon, which in the Middle Ages had blown an invasion fleet of Chinese away from the Japanese shore where they were going to invade. By January of 45, several squadrons of kamikazes had been formed. Although American fighters and anti-aircraft usually would prove effective against kamikazes, some pilots would ultimately get through, and the casualties would mount. By the time of the Battle of Okinawa, it was becoming less easy, though, for them to find men. Growing tendencies of pilots to return to the base and reports they had seen no enemies. So the Japanese sent fire escorts to ensure that the pilots did their duty. An 18-year-old kamikaze pilot at age 93 related how until these teenage pilots were harangued by their officers, no one wished to volunteer. This is what he said. There was not a single person among us who would have decided on their own to die. We were essentially pressured into committing suicide. This man survived because before the final attack that he was supposed to launch, Japan surrendered and the mission was canceled. Now, this is a map of the picket line. You can see here these circles, and these were destroyers deployed around the perimeter of the invasion fleet, and they would serve as an early warning system so that they would be able to launch aircraft, and as well they'd be able to better shoot down the Japanese invasions, these picket boats. However, even though they had great electronic equipment, these radar picket stations were had the greatest danger of being attacked. These pickets were anywhere from 1 to 100 miles from land. And there was a tendency by the Japanese to attack them because they were the first ships they saw. So the destroyers were both the guardians and the sacrificial lambs. And certainly they alerted the ships, but they themselves became major targets rather than the large capital ships and aircraft carriers. The Japanese employed various evasive tactics, dipping, rising, falling, coming within 10 feet of the ocean. They came in singly and in pairs and in large groups, and most of them concentrated on these small picket ships. A few did go further toward the beaches. The pickets suffered badly as the divine wind blew across their bows. The Japanese, though, incurred huge losses. The destroyers, too, showed the effects of combat, many of them having gaping wounds from the hurling aircraft. The Royal Navy, since March 26th, their contingent of aircraft carriers were performing a useful mission of pounding airfields and intercepting Japanese planes off Formosa. But the kamikazes also attacked them. Here is the result of the attack on the Formidable. Now, the difference was when they crashed into the British deck, these were steel decks, and they crumpled like an eggshell. So even though you can see smoke coming, it did not penetrate into the interior of the ship, and therefore serious fires did not happen. Now, on our aircraft carriers with wooden flight decks, they did penetrate, and we did have very serious casualties in many instances. Well, here is the result of the kamikaze attacks. Counting all of them, over 3,000 sorties were launched against our naval forces. In addition, hundreds of attacks by conventional dive bombers and torpedo planes, besides the kamikazes. You can see 21 ships sunk, another 86 damaged. The result could have been far worse, except for the great skills and bravery of the United States Navy and Marine personnel. Now let's go back to the island and the command bunker. Now we're up to May 3rd and 4th. Despite disappointment, the kamikazes certainly did not destroy the invasion fleet, and the strategy didn't work. Many of the young colonels at the headquarters of the Japanese, and here it is in Shuri Castle, they wanted to make an all-out massive counterattack. General Yoshima knew it would not work. He relented, and he allowed them to make the counterattack. They hurled the 24th Division against the Marine 7th U.S. 7th Infantry Division, and a minor attack against the 1st Marine Division. The kamikazes attacked supporting these thrusts. The Japanese offensive was crushed because of American artillery and tactical aircraft, as well as offshore naval gunfire. The Japanese lost 5,000 men. The U.S. a little over 1,000. And also, they disclosed the hidden cave positions of the Japanese. So this counterattack at dawn was chaotic and hopeless. It represented the last Imperial Army offensive of the Second World War. And certainly their resources, they could not launch another attack of this. Yoshima ordered the forces back into the caves and bunkers, and they resumed the defense. Yoshima now tried without much hope to encourage his aides. On the other side, General Bruckner ordered his forces to go over to the immediate offensive. By May 8th, VE Day in Europe, the Americans' initiative had passed to the Allies forever. Now, at the same time, not only did we have to worry about naval air attacks by the Japanese and their fierce defense, but also we had a typhoon. The weather challenged the Allied invasion fleet. Unlike the 13th century storms, the typhoons in 1944 and 45 didn't save Japan from defeat. But a later October 1945 typhoon showed what could have happened if the Japanese hadn't surrendered in August. On June 2nd and 3rd, naval forecasters had said that Typhoon Kani was coming and would move over Okinawa. Admiral Halsey ordered the fleet to turn away from the shallow waters and go further away from the kamikaze attacks. As it turned out, instead of tracking in Okinawa, Typhoon Kani tracked to meet the third task force. On June 5th, 1945, it smashed into the third fleet, 50 to 60 foot seas. The central pressure fell to 28 inches, which is very low, and sustained winds of 115 miles per hour, with gusts up to 150. Those of you in the desert know how high gusts of wind can cause the sand to obliterate visibility. You can imagine what it was like in the ocean. 33 ships were damaged, 6 were lost. Airplanes were destroyed when they broke loose. 76 planes were destroyed. On October 24th, a second typhoon after the war was over, Typhoon Louise, hit the island of Okinawa itself, which turned a major military base for the invasion into a mess. The typhoon seriously damaged U.S. ships and shore facilities in Okinawa. It sank 12 U.S. ships and washed 222 other ships and landing craft ashore. Killed 36 Americans, injured 100. My Uncle Jim, was caught in this storm. He was guarding Japanese POWs on the island at that time. He told me it was the most frightening experience of his entire life. In the U.S. Navy history of this storm, it was said, quote, if the war had not ended when it did, this damage, especially the grounding and damage to 170 amphibious craft, would likely have seriously impacted the planned invasion of Japan. Now let's return to the last phase of the battle, the mainland battle, May 11th to June the 22nd. The Japanese situation had deteriorated steadily through May and early June. American forces slowly pushed into the southernmost area of the island. Yoshijima's forces were unable to withstand the relentless pressure of superior firepower. On May 30th, Shuri Castle, the last bastion, fell, and the battle was nearly over. American infantrymen walked into former headquarters of the Japanese 32nd Army. Utter destruction. Heavy shells and bombardments had torn the town apart. Only a Methodist church and a two-story concrete building still stood. Shuri Castle itself was demolished. In this fortress from which the former kings of Okinawa had ruled, nothing now lived. The Japanese left their dead and retreated south. The last center of organized resistance had dissolved. Okay. In the next 3 weeks, Yoshijima managed to form a major miracle by organizing another zone of defense, but he knew it would not hold. The end was close. And now something very unusual happened. After dropping millions of leaflets upon the Japanese to assure them of fair treatment, for the first time, hundreds of tattered and dirty Japanese soldiers came out of caves and walked toward American lines with their hands held up high. Eventually, 7,000 Japanese would surrender. This was the largest surrender of the Pacific War. During a week of heavy fighting, the Japanese lines began to crumble. Then on the 18th of June, on the brink of final victory, tragedy struck the Americans. General Simon Bruckner died from a wound sustained on a visit to one of his forward positions. Within 3 days, Yoshima also died by his own hand. He had scorned an American officer's offer to surrender and spare the lives of his remaining forces. On June the 21st, he and his chief of staff knelt outside the Japanese headquarters and committed ceremonial harikiri. The 82-day long battle of the stronghold of Okinawa was over. The last remnants of Japanese resistance ended on June 21st, though some Japanese continued hiding, including the future governor of the prefecture of Okinawa. The official surrender ceremony was held on September 7th. So here are now the losses for both the Allies and the Japanese. The Americans suffered over 82,000 casualties, including non-battle casualties, psychiatric injuries, illnesses. Over 12,500 were killed and missing in the American Army and Marines. The battlefield deaths were 4,600 Army, 2,900, almost 3,000 Marine. The Navy casualties, protracted air and sea battles were very heavy. Close to 5,000 sailors died, another 5,000 were wounded. This far exceeded the losses suffered in any previous U.S. naval campaign, period. As Winston Churchill put it in the message to President Truman on June the 22nd, quote, "This battle is among the most intense and famous of military history. We make our salute to all of your troops and their commanders engaged. The most complete tally during the battle is the Cornerstone of Peace Monument at Okinawa Prefecture Memorial Museum. This identifies the names of each individual in Okinawa in World War II who died. As of 2010, the monument lists over 240,000 names. This includes almost 149,000 Okinawan civilians, 77,000 Imperial Japanese soldiers, over 14,000 American soldiers, and a smaller number of people from South Korea, the United Kingdom, North Korea, and Taiwan. 40,000 of the Okinawan civilians killed had been drafted or impressed by the Japanese army and are often counted as combat deaths. Thus was the final tally of human casualties of Okinawa, by far the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, the Crucible of the Pacific. "90% of the buildings on the island were destroyed, with countless historical monuments, artifacts, and cultural treasures. The tropical landscape was turned into one vast field of mud, lead, decay, and maggots. However, the military value of Okinawa for the Allies exceeded all hopes. Okinawa provided a major fleet anchorage and troop staging area and for airfields for the potential invasion of Japan. You see on this map the proposed Operation Downfall invasion. If Ujima hoped that by destroying the Americans, he would spare the homeland, he was wrong. Because, as we well know, the cities of Japan were burned to the ground. The Battle of Okinawa had ended in another overwhelming American victory. An entire Japanese army had been wiped out, with hundreds of planes and the greatest battleship in the Imperial Navy. Yet few Americans who took part in this campaign felt any sense of victory. The general feeling was one of anxiety and dread. If the attack on Okinawa had been this bad, what would the assault on Japan be like? In Washington, Tokyo, Manila, Guam, the Japanese and American planners were studying that question. Today, military historians believe that Okinawa led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a means of avoiding the planned ground assault. There is little doubt that Operation Iceberg, this crushing defeat, helped to melt down the obstacles to surrender. It helped to persuade the Emperor of Japan and other key Japanese leaders to finally end the war on September 2nd, 1945. Thus ends our story of the Battle of Okinawa, the Crucible of the Pacific, and a great American victory that in the end helped to end the war and also avoid the horrific invasion of Japan that was predicted would cause over 1 million American casualties. Thank you for attending this program. I look forward to seeing you all in the future at the museum.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Very, very good presentation. Like we started off, wow, it's a heavy, hard to digest topic.
Yes.
The one question I kind of walk away with a little bit, and I don't know if you can help me understand, the people in Japan, now they were already being bombed, the B-29s were already coming over. Were they aware of the staggering defeat at Okinawa, or was that shielded from them?
That was shielded from them. The propaganda was that the Imperial Army and Navy had smashed the Americans. But, of course, the steady area campaign that incinerated Tokyo and the other Japanese cities. The lack of food, because by then the Japanese people were starving. It belied this propaganda. But there were members of the Imperial General Staff that still wanted to fight that war, that battle. And of course, you know, I've covered that in another program, Fireball in the Night, which talks about the firebombing and the atomic bomb. And in the end, thank God we didn't invade. And of course, it was there were two bad choices, invading or dropping the atomic bomb. And Truman chose the dropping of the bomb as the least worst choice. And let us hope to God we never see another atomic bomb used ever again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. We look forward to seeing you in March and welcome you back to Palm Springs. Until then, be well. All of our best, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Well, just make sure you don't change the weather now. When I get there, I want it to be sunny and nice. All right?
We'll lock it in. Bring your golf club.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.